He was a janitor and a single father, and there was a black SUV idling under the weak streetlight outside his narrow house, engine thrumming like a heart trying to steady itself. Jonah Romer stood at the window, palms pressed to the cool glass, watching the dark shape wait. He did not know who had come or why. He only knew that the night before had been long and soaked through, and that the knock on his door had started a thread that might unravel everything he'd been holding together. Flashback. The rain had sounded like an urgent drummer beating the alley into pieces. It began as an ordinary night. Jonah back from a double shift at the municipal building, his trousers still smelling faintly of bleach and old coffee, his janitor cart pushed into the shed like a soldier put to rest. He had the sort of tired that sits in the shoulders and refuses to unclench. Inside the small house, the only lights were the thin glow through his daughter's bedroom door. Jessa and Kylie slept with mismatched blankets and a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. They had fallen asleep to the sound of him making a soft rhythm with the broom as he hummed a tune he could not afford to forget. Jonah's life had become a ledger of small things that needed doing. Sweep this floor, wipe that edge, replace one broken bulb with another salvaged from a supply closet. He took pride in it. There was dignity in the steady motion of the mop and the way light reflected cleanly off a freshly waxed stairwell. But dignity did not pay late notices. He kept a stack of bills folded under a magnet on the refrigerator, the edges softened from being taken out and checked and folded again. He kept a cracked phone on the counter, its glass spiderwebbed from a drop in the rain months ago, its battery a traitor that died when you needed it most. There were other things he carried with him, calluses that mapped the silhouette of his life, the groove in his thumb where a wood chisel had sat one winter when he taught himself to carve, the small pile of wooden animals in an old shoebox labeled market stock. Carving was his secret steadiness, the work of his hands that whispered something like hope into the world. He sold a few pieces at weekends sometimes, set up on a folding table under a tent, the smell of sap and fresh sawdust mingling with kettle corn. When money was short, he'd take whatever he could from the jar and wrap it with the girls' drawings. The crafts kept him afloat and gave him something to put on the shelf besides overdue notices. That evening, he had been in the middle of varnishing a tiny wooden reindeer for Jessa when the storm arrived in earnest. The sound started as a distant roll and then crowded the walls until the house felt like the inside of a drum. Jonah listened to the rain, to the way it fussed and hammered, and he thought about the extra oxygen bill that would come at the end of the month, and how he would have to skip the market next weekend to cover it.
He had just checked the meter when the knock came. It was quick, the kind of anxious knocking you hear when someone is cold and cramped and wants to be inside before the night swallows them whole. Jonah opened the door to three faces, a small soaked boy with hair clinging to his forehead like a drowned thing, an old woman hunched over, rain beating along her coat, and a boy who stood behind them with wet sneakers, one hand clutching the woman's sleeve. The boy, 5 years old, wide-eyed, pressed a soggy teddy to his chest and stared at Jonah as if the janitor might be an answer to a prayer he'd forgotten. "Please," the man with him said. His voice was rough with the cold. He touched his grandmother's shoulder, as if to steady both of them. When the old woman blinked, her eyes carried the vacant look Jonah had seen before at the hospital when he'd mopped floors near waiting rooms. Jonah had seen people get lost in places once, a woman searching for the mother she couldn't find, an elderly man who kept asking for a job he had held 50 years ago. He recognized the same fragile thing in the old woman's face, moments of clarity swallowed by a fog. "Come in," Jonah said. He stepped back, letting them through the threshold. The house smelled like boiled cabbage and the faint lingering of his day, cleaning spray and the soft sour of old socks. He folded a big towel over the boy's shoulders, then another around the old woman's thin shoulders. He pointed to the couch and to the kettle. He moved with the kind, practiced motions of someone used to making space for other people's mess. Inside, Evan, because that is what the boy called himself when Jonah asked, collapsed on the couch and tucked the teddy under his chin. Jonah's daughters, awake now and drawn by the voices, hovered at the doorway in their pajamas, eyes rimmed with the hazy light of the night. Jonah introduced himself, keeping his voice low. "This is Jonah. You can call me Jonah." He handed the old woman a warm cup and a blanket. Her hands trembled as she accepted them. Her name came out in a soft, confused syllable. "Margaret," she whispered. Then her eyes clouded and she asked where she was, twice. Jonah made soup. It was not the elaborate stew he remembered his mother making. It was a chicken soup he'd learned from a recipe on a torn slip of paper in a food pantry. He added more water because Evan needed the warmth and the house needed to smell like something other than damp. He set a candle on the coffee table even though he knew candles were a small dangerous luxury in a house with small children. The flame was a tiny defiance against the storm, a domestic lighthouse. As Jonah worked, Evan curled up on the rug and watched him, eyes wide and suspicious. The boy's bass came quick and sharp, and his hands kept clinging to the soggy rabbit. Once Evan's breath slowed, Jonah sat beside him and ran his big thumb along the rabbit's ear until the child's eyes drooped.
Jonah's hand was rough where the chisel burned his skin, and the boy's fingers found the scar on his knuckle and held it as if it were familiar. Margaret, when she could be coaxed into stillness, looked at Jonah and smiled with a clarity that made his throat briefly ache. She said, "You have good hands," and Jonah felt for a moment that he had been seen. He told them a little about himself, that he worked nights cleaning at the Civic Center, and that his girls were Jessa and Kylie, ages 7 and 4. He said nothing of the paycheck that would arrive thinner than expected, of the rent that had crept up like a shadow. Evan kept asking where his mother was. He said it the way small children say things precipitously, as if a missing person could be named into existence. Jonah told him gently that someone would come for them, that they were safe here. He felt ridiculous saying it. He could barely keep his own house warm, but words have a way of making warm what they touch. After Evan had a bowl of soup and had been tucked between 2 cushions, Jonah cleared a space on the small dining table and spread out his tools. He picked up a half-finished wooden reindeer, and without quite thinking why, he handed it to the boy. "Till you can take better care of it," he said. The reindeer was rough at the edges. Jonah's hands smoothed them with care. The boy clasped it like a relic and named it Snow. That night the house held the storm in its chest. The sound of rain against the roof was constant, a wet applause. Jonah set an extra blanket over the old woman and sat in the kitchen with the kettle on low, thinking. He thought about the times his daughters had learned more from him in a single gesture than from any lecture, the way he said please and thank you, the way he paid back a neighbor for a borrowed ladder with a carved bird. He thought of his ex, Sarah, who had left 2 years before, taking with her half of the quiet they had once shared. He did not think about why she left. He simply accepted the empty chair at the table. He breathed in, steadying himself, letting the scent of soup fill the places that worry narrowed. Margaret woke frequently. Sometimes she called out for a husband who had died decades ago. Sometimes she reached for photos she could not quite place. Once, in a rare clearing, she called Evan by a different name, Andrew, and sobbed at the sound of it. The memory was a small, fragile thing that came and went like a bird visiting a window. At one point, late and bone-tired, Jonah found himself sitting on the floor beside Margaret, the candle flame painting soft shadows across her face. "You're not alone," he said, because the words seemed to fit the shape of the night. Margaret's hand brushed his, and for a second she looked at him straight on. "Thank you," she said, and there was a transparency in her eyes that felt like a gift. Jonah had known caregivers who bore their fatigue like an extra coat, practical and private.
He had seen exhaustion wear people thin while they did the right thing. He began to measure his own resources, the little cash he kept stashed in a coffee tin, the credit balance on his mobile plan, the packets of instant oatmeal in the pantry. He tallied what he could give, time, a warm couch, a bowl of soup, and what he could not, long-term care, deep doctor's visits, months of sustained support. When Evan slipped awake and whimpered in his sleep, Jonah rose and reached for the wooden reindeer he had given the boy. He traced the grooves he had carved, thinking about the way wood accepted pressure and then kept the memory in its grain. There was something about making, about shaping matter into a thing with purpose, that soothed him. He set tools on the table, ran his thumb over a nick and a spatula, and let a silent promise sink in. He would not let his children see him flinch when the world knocked. The house was small and quiet, except for the storm and the breathing of the sleeping children. Jonah did not sleep well. He dozed and woke, and listened for the creak of the old house settling and for any noise from the street. At one point, he padded to the window and looked out. The rain blurred everything into a watercolor smear. The porch light cast a small, anxious pool. There was nothing outside but the world being washed. At 3 a.m, Margaret sat up suddenly, the room sliding into her eyes with a new, painful focus. Where is he?" she asked, jaw working as though trying to hold back a name that would stab her with its absence. Jonah, who had been dozing on the couch, sat bolt upright. He had no medical training. He had only empathy and the selfish fear of a father who could not afford to fail his girls. He reached for the phone, but hesitated. The battery read 14%, and the charger was in the drawer with the broken tape. "Is there a son?" Jonah asked, careful. Margaret coughed and blinked and rummaged through the fog in search of an answer. Then she put a hand flat to her chest, snapped awake with a clarity that was almost cruel in its suddenness. "Andrew," she said, the name like a bell, and Jonah listened to the way it landed. Evan stirred and woke, asking for Grandma by name in a child's voice that was half fear, half hope. Margaret's eyes filled. "Call him," she told Jonah. "He'll come. He always comes." Jonah looked at the cracked screen and wondered whether a name was enough. He found himself saying, "What's his last name?" "Porter," Margaret said,
and then she was gone again, the edges of her thought fraying. "Andrew Porter," she repeated, as if praying the words into the air would anchor her to them. Jonah hesitated a long moment. He could have called 911 or a non-emergency hospital line, but he also knew the hospital's waiting rooms, and the way care can be slow when your ability to pay is not clear. He fumbled for the number in memory's fog. No, he didn't have it.
He had to rely on Margaret's betrayed memory and the boy's tongue. "Do you know his number?" he asked Evan. The child clutched his rabbit and shook his head. He did not understand why the night had to feel so heavy. Jonah wrapped a blanket tighter around Margaret and spooned soup into Evan, letting the steam knit them together for a while. He sat with Margaret, watching her fingers and the way her knuckles nodded and released, a small, intimate study of the human body performing itself. The candle burned low. The house smelled of boiled soup, wet wool, old wood, and the faint chemical scent of a floor cleaner Jonah used at work, one that seemed to strip everything down to what it needed to be. He thought of his daughters and of how, in some silent way, he had promised them that the world would not teach them to be cruel. He wanted them to see him make the choice that mattered most. He wanted them to know that kindness was not an item on a to-do list. It was the heart of how one lived. When Margaret woke again with a flurry of questions, where she was, where the bank was from decades ago, what day it was, Jonah answered as gently as he could. He used names and moments, the scaffolding of a life, to build a structure around her that would hold for now. Sometimes she sat still and listened, and then smiled like a woman remembering a joke. Once she said, with heartbreaking precision, "I'm sorry I forgot the way back," and Jonah wanted to say 1,000 things, about memory, about loss, about forgiving what the body cannot keep, but he wiped his hand across his face and simply replied, "It's all right, you're safe here." The night curled on. Evan slept at last, cheeks flushed from the soup, the wooden reindeer cradled like a talisman. Jonah stayed awake in the kitchen, drinking a small thermos of coffee he'd reheated on the stove, testing the limits of his own patience. He began to tell himself stories, small, plausible versions of the morning to come. The sun shows up, grateful and composed, grateful for the human decency that kept his mother safe. Maybe the son would be a kind man who knew how to give back. Maybe he would be awkward and sincere. Or maybe he would be a businessman in a black SUV whose eyes softened when he saw the carved animals on Jonah's table. Thoughts like these are dangerous because they collect into wishes. Jonah flinched at his own yearning and then laughed softly, a sound like someone clipping a loose thread. He took a chisel and in the slow quiet began to carve another small deer. The motion steadied him. He could measure his life in grooves and shavings. It was a language he understood. At some point before the first light, the house shifted subtly. The rain eased into a whisper, and the storm's pressure loosened. Jonah felt the world take a breath. Margaret stirred once more and reached blindly for the phone. Jonah watched as she punched at numbers with a practiced stubbornness.
She brought the phone to her ear and said with a clarity that seemed to erase the fog, "Andrew, it's Mama. I don't—" Her voice broke like thin ice. Jonah hovered in the doorway, the carved deer half finished in his hands. He did not want to listen in on someone else's private life, but a sliver of that old, clean human curiosity, the part that wants to know how the story will resolve, pushed him to stand still and hear. Margaret's words were uneven, like a sewing machine with a frayed belt. "Andrew," she repeated, "I'm at a house. There's a kind man. He's been so kind. Jonah, he's a janitor." She stumbled over the details, and then, in a voice that was like carved wood, she said, "They're safe. Evan is here." There was a crack in her sentence, and then a hopefulness that felt like a hand reaching for an answer. Silence followed on the other end, a long-held breath. Jonah could see the shape of a conversation happening miles away, in a place he could not name. Margaret's fingers tightened on the phone until the knuckles whitened. "Andrew?" she said again. This time, Jonah heard urgency, a rusted gate trying to open. He flinched, because there are moments when one ear hears only the truth and another life, and there is nothing to do but wait. When the voice came back, someone speaking fast, then calming, a man checking and arranging,
Margaret's face softened. She repeated a street name, and Jonah heard, distantly, the shape of a life dragging itself together. It was the first clear thread of color after a night of gray. Jonah set the partly carved deer on the table. He felt in a complex, small way that he had done something right. He had been a threshold. He had allowed shelter into a cold world. He had no idea how long right would last, or whether it would be rewarded in coin or kindness, but he had acted. Before the words on the phone could finish knitting a plan, Evan stirred, and the house leaned toward morning. Jonah looked at the window. The street lamp had a pool of light that the rain had not yet dispersed. He thought about the balance of risk and mercy, a thought he had revisited since his ex left, since the bills grew teeth, and the girls went to bed hungry sometimes, since the world's expectation of him shrank into a pocket he could check on lonely nights. He thought, too, of the example he wanted to set for Jessa and Kylie, that the world gives and takes, and that you must choose to give even when you have little, that you can be a man who opens a door and sits through the night to keep someone else from being afraid. He pictured them in years to come, two little people who would have an early lesson about what it means to be human handed to them on a damp couch between sips of chicken soup. Jonah's phone, the cracked face straining in the dim light, vibrated once on the kitchen counter. A message, an automated reminder, popped up about an electricity payment. He glanced, felt the prickle in his neck, and then pushed the phone face down.
Some problems could wait until morning. Some people could not. When the rain lifted enough for a rooster of light to sample the edges of the sky, Margaret folded the phone into her palm like a held rosary and looked directly at Jonah. "I remember a name," she said. The name was soft and steady when it left her mouth. "Andrew Porter." Jonah nodded, keeping his voice small. "We'll wait for him," he said. Outside, the road slung beads of water along the asphalt. A car passed somewhere in the distance. Its headlights sliced brief, nervous lines across the horizon. Jonah put on the kettle and busied himself with small tasks, a ritual to keep his hands from fretting. He refilled a bowl with warm water and set it by the door for shoes that might be wet. He wrapped another blanket and placed it on the couch, a gesture that felt like a promise to the house. Evan woke and found the reindeer in his hands. He named the deer again and hugged it close. Jessa and Kylie sat at the small table, cradling mugs of warm milk, eyes wide with the sort of curiosity only children have for events that adults call emergencies. They watched Jonah with that steady, unspoken assessment that children give to the guardian of their world. Jonah liked how they watched. It was an honest appraisal that made him want to be larger than he sometimes felt. And then, at the edge of sleep and before the world arranged itself into morning, Jonah noticed it, a distant hum, too deliberate to be a passing car, a sound that threaded itself like a promise or a threat across the wet streets. He went to the window and waited. The light beyond the glass had split into two bright orbs approaching slowly, punctuating the dark. He did not yet know who had arrived. He only knew with a kind of focused certainty that whatever came next would lean toward him like a question he was about to answer. He folded his hands on the sill, feeling the roughness of his skin against the glass, and waited for the engine's sound to tell him whether the day would be ordinary, or whether somehow the life he was carving in small pieces might intersect with someone who could help shape it into something more. A black shape cut a wedge of shadow on the wet pavement and eased into the curb, headlights slanting against Jonah's porch like blank pages waiting for ink. The black SUV eased to a stop like a slow exhale, its tires hissing on wet asphalt. Jonah watched the silhouette through the blurred glass, the engine's rumble soft against the house's waking sounds. He did not yet know the shape of the man who stepped out, only that someone had come and that for reasons he could not fully name, the night's labor had not been in vain. If this story is touching something in you, subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. A door opened on the street with the kind of urgency that pushes gentle people into motion.
A man moved across the wet pavement and up Jonah's narrow path with a stride more hurried than the cleats of his shoes suggested. He wore a dark coat that had been picked carefully for a commute, and when he removed his gloves, Jonah could see impatience written in the lines around his mouth. He carried himself with the lean, efficient readiness of someone used to meetings and schedules and phone calls that happened in the corners of airports. He stopped under Jonah's porch light, dripping a polite constellation light on a welcome mat. When Jonah opened the door, the man took one quick step forward, as if to cradle Margaret with words. His hair was damp, and his eyes were large, with that raw, uneven mixture of relief and fear that people have when they are late to a part of their lives that matters. "Mom," he said, and the name cracked free, like weather breaking. He looked at Jonah then, as if expecting accusation, and finding only a stratagem of coffee stains and salt on the jeans. "You must be Andrew," Jonah said. The name fit the last pieces of the night into place. The man's face altered quickly. Relief poured in on top of the roughness. He took Margaret's hand with the awkward tenderness of a child who had grown into a man too quickly. "I am," Andrew said. He swallowed, and then he looked at Jonah fully. "Thank you," he said, in the way a man might thank someone for a life well kept. His voice had the coiled quality of someone who had rehearsed gratitude in the elevator of an office building a dozen times, but never in a kitchen lit by a lone candle. Andrew's hands found Jonah's, calloused and plain. He had noticed the small carved deer on the coffee table, and the pile of wooden animals set under a corner lamp. He picked one up like a man examining family history. The deer's edges were sanded smooth, the wood's grain pronounced under Jonah's finish. Andrew turned the piece over in his hands, and something like recognition loosened in him. Did you make them?" Andrew asked. Jonah did not like to talk about how he made them. It sounded too soft for the roughness of his life. "I do them on nights off," Jonah said. "Just small things." Andrew let out a breath that could have been a laugh and could have been a prayer. "They're beautiful." He looked back to his mother as if to check whether that moment was real. Margaret watched him with an expression the years had not yet erased. She seemed to measure the man before her, as if rediscovering a map. "Andrew," she said again, the name like a stitch pulled tight and then eased. Andrew sank into a chair like a man who has finally surrendered to a tide he could no longer outrun. He cupped his hands, and for the first time in the hour he looked exhausted in a way that was not simply from travel. "I'm so sorry," he said. The apology was for more than minutes and miscommunications. It hung in the room like steam. "I'm Jonah," Jonah said again, more to ground the exchange than to introduce himself.
You found them? Andrew nodded. "Yes. I'm with Porter Logistics. We manage distribution for small businesses, mostly. I get calls and board meetings, and He stopped, embarrassed by the sentence's missing edges. He had run into a life that could not be reduced to a single tidy explanation. He told Jonah, haltingly, about a call at 2 a.m. the night before. He'd been certain he'd return to his mother's apartment and find she'd been safe. But somewhere in the last weeks, the calls had outpaced the visits. The office had kept him traveling, Margaret's memory had frayed, and her single moments of danger outpaced the schedule he'd made for himself. The storm had pushed them into the street and then into Jonah's doorway. He had seen their car a block down and had followed a trail of footprints and an improbably placed porch light to find his mother on a stranger's couch. Jonah watched Andrew closely as the man's shoulders unrolled and his hands stopped clenching. He saw in Andrew's face a mixture of guilt and gratitude that seemed to make room for a different kind of hope. There was a respect toward Jonah that was not performative. Andrew's posture softened, his voice smoothed. "Your hands," Andrew said, turning again to the crafts. There are people who look for this. There are customers who want things that are real, that come from someone who knows the thing he makes." He paused, struggling to find the right cadence between charity and business. "We can help with that. We can help you get them into stores." Jonah felt the word help like a small animal in a trap, warm and dangerous at once. He had learned to receive help gingerly. It came with conditions, often invisible ones. He adjusted his stance, as if preparing for a negotiation he had not sought. "I can't promise miracles," Andrew said quickly, reading Jonah's face as if it were a ledger. "I don't mean a cash windfall, but I can get your pieces into a few regional shops. I can help with displays. We have contacts who build small artisan programs, who do training, who can teach how to scale without losing what matters." He glanced at Margaret, and there was a heartbreak in the softness with which he said her name. "And I want to make sure she's safe. That's why I came." But he looked back at Jonah, earnest and a little afraid. "I want to do more than just thank you." Jonah measured the man on his porch by the set of his jaw and the clarity of his offer. Partnership, distribution, a storefront, words that might fix the frayed edges of his life and also change the contours of who he was. He was not unfamiliar with being offered things that came with a price: pride, autonomy, a corner of the life he'd been carving. He had been offered charity before and had refused it because he needed dignity as much as he needed bread. "I don't take charity," Jonah said slowly. He heard the careful politeness in his own tone. He was trying to be honest without hurting the man who had found his mother. Andrew nodded, as if he expected this. "Not charity," he said. "Partnership. We can brand them properly. Romer's Grace. Give you a store, small at first, where items from people like you are sold. And a co-op, Hands of Grace. We can create jobs, train single parents who need flexible hours, bring in seniors who want work that doesn't break them. He said the words as if they were simple keys. They were not simple keys. They were keys that unlocked a lot of possibilities and a lot of risk. Jonah thought of his girls. He imagined Jessa setting tags on a line, and Kylie arranging a small window display of painted birds. He imagined doing something that reached beyond a folding table on weekends, something steady and dignified. He imagined keeping a roof over their heads without the daily squeeze of worry eroding the small joys. He thought too of the price a partnership might exact. Would his work be diluted, turned into product lines that lost their handmade insistence? Would his name become a label on a shelf he no longer recognized? He looked at the deer Andrew held, a small thing, stubbornly human. Jonah's hands hovered for a moment over the grain. Then he withdrew. "I'm a janitor," he said finally. "That's my job. I sweep floors and empty bins. I do this," he gestured at the animals, "on my nights off. I don't want to be sold out." The worry in his voice was honest rather than theatrical. Andrew's reply was immediate and compassionate. "I get that. I work those hours too. I know what it is to be split. I don't want to take your voice away from what you make. I want to amplify it. We do distribution for makers like you. We can maintain your control. We can get you a storefront that's yours. I'll help with marketing and with setting up a cooperative model so the profits help people who need steady work." He folded his hands into a plea that was also an offer. There was a thin, private moment when Jonah thought of the world he could not give his daughters in the present. He had promised to keep them human, to teach them to open doors. That promise had a price. It was not only bread. It was the risk of being known and helped. He looked at his girls in the doorway, at their wide eyes and their sleepy, earnest faces, and felt the decision like a stone settled in his chest. "Okay," Jonah said at last. The word felt like a hinge swinging open. He put his hand into Andrew's, and they shook there on the threshold, a janitor and a businessman, two men whose lives had just collided in a damp morning that smelled of soup and sodium chloride, and the possibility of repair. Inside, Margaret watched the exchange, and then, in a soft voice that had the flint of someone lucky enough to wake, said, "Call it Romer's grace." Her words landed in the room like a blessing from someone who had almost lost the map to her own heart.
The arrangement that followed was practical and meticulous. Andrew insisted on taking Margaret to a nearby clinic to make sure she was seen by a physician who could document her memory concerns and arrange post-visit support. Jonah accompanied them to the clinic, and on the ride in Andrew's SUV, the black vehicle that seemed to carry responsibility and a little shame, Margaret slept with the deer Jonah had given Evan resting against her knee. The clinic visit was formal but quick. Andrew handled the logistics with a manager's dexterity. Paperwork signed, referral given, numbers exchanged. He asked Jonah quietly whether he would trust him to manage the development of a small showcase at a local market, and whether they could talk about creating a permanent place where Jonah's pieces and those of other local artisans could be sold. Jonah, who had once been suspicious of men with suits and promises, felt inattentive to the mechanics of business and oddly relieved by the clarity. Over the next weeks, the small sun of change rose, and the neighborhood noticed. Andrew kept his word. He used his contacts to open a small slot for Jonah at a popular weekend art walk. He arranged a meeting with a friend who ran a local co-op and with a small nonprofit director who specialized in training people with interrupted work histories. They drafted a plan. Romer's Grace would begin as a pop-up shop in a reclaimed storefront owned by a landlord who was keen on neighborhood revitalization. Hands of Grace would be a cooperative arm, a membership where participants could access part-time work, skill-building workshops, and a small stipend until their income stabilized. Jonah signed the documents with the same deliberate touch he used when sanding a piece of wood, careful, slow, reverent. He did not read all the contract's clauses, he was learning, but he made sure two things were clear. First, the pieces bore his mark, a small carved R on the base of each native animal ornament. Second, decision-making would be collaborative. Andrew invited him into a quarterly meeting. They would keep profits transparent, and the cooperative would operate under a democratically elected board of members, including the artisans themselves. The weeks that followed were not cinematic with sudden rescue. There were routine frustrations, permits taking longer than expected, a supplier who delayed a delivery, an electrical issue in the storefront that cost a weekend of wages to fix. Jonah kept working his janitorial shifts. He sweated over new schedules and practiced patience like a muscle. He still scrubbed public toilets at dawn, his uniform a quiet sign of dignity. He brought his girls to the shop during slow afternoons, letting them arrange small displays of painted birds and clay buttons. The girls learned to greet customers with a warmth that was not showy but honest. The first time a regular complimented Jessa on a tag she had written, Jonah felt sawdust and money and pride coalesce in one soft glow. Andrew proved to be not merely a well-connected man, but an earnest one. He showed up at community meetings, drove deliveries, hammered negligently and cheerfully when a shelf needed fixing. He had a knack for logistics and a genuine willingness to place himself in uncomfortable vulnerability. He spoke at a fundraiser about his mother's memory like a man confessing a debt. His story of being a son who had been busy and who had to learn to show up moved people. It moved a local reporter, too, who wrote a careful piece about neighborhood compassion and about the importance of remembering elders as community members rather than burdens. Margaret's role in the shop was delicate. Early-stage Alzheimer's is a complicated presence. It is a thing that shapes lives without being easily named. Some mornings she came to Romer's Grace with clarity, folding little bundles of product with hands that remembered more than her mind could hold. She would tell visitors stories about small things, about Andrew as a boy who once made a fort out of a tarp and a broom, and people listened, charmed by the clarity that seemed to arrive like a visiting bird. Other days she was quieter, content to sit by the window and watch customers pass. The cooperative found roles for her that honored both her capabilities and her limits, greeting regulars, tying simple bows, or, when the day required less precision, telling stories to the children who wandered in with sticky fingers. The cooperative became an engine of small dignity. Single parents with awkward job gaps found schedules that flexed around school pickups. Seniors who wanted to supplement their income found work that made sense, hand finishing, packaging, teaching craft sessions for school kids. Jonah ran workshops on basic woodworking techniques in the afternoons, teaching calluses to form in willing hands and teaching patience, how rough edges could become soft with attention. He would watch a man produce his first carved bird and then see him walk home with the weight of something made in his own hands. For Jonah, this was as valuable as any paycheck. There were setbacks. A delivery truck once scraped the storefront's awning and caused a weekend of repair. A grant application for a training fund didn't come through. Jonah learned to hold both gratitude and frustration at once. He kept his janitorial shifts through the early months because the income was steady in the way that whispered promises can be steady, always there, sometimes the only thing reliable in a life of small tremors. Evan's presence in the Romer household changed both slowly and profoundly. He began to arrive on Saturdays like a boy with a new anchor.
Jessa and Kylie took to him with surprising ferocity. They taught him how to make paper cranes and how to line up toy cars by color. Evan's fear of being left dimmed under the steady routine of shared breakfasts and Sunday visits. He kept the wooden deer on a shelf near his bed and sometimes woke in the night holding it like a talisman. Margaret's memory did not cure, but some mornings she would sit and tell Evan a story about when Andrew hid in the curtains to avoid going to school. Evan would laugh, delighted by the sense that he had been woven into a new family tale. The community noticed, and so did a local reporter named Marisol. She came with a notebook and a gentle curiosity, capturing the small, graceful lines of their life. Her article, titled Romer's Grace, How a Door Opened Twice Changed a Neighborhood, was careful and kind. She wrote about Jonah sweeping floors at dawn and teaching children to sand wood at noon. She wrote about how a businessman returned to his roots and how a cooperative gave people a place to learn and to make money without losing what made their work human. The piece generated a modest bump in customers and a few donations from local businesses that wanted to support the cause. The shop's first big day felt like an experiment. They had a small ribbon with a town councilor who gave an undersung speech about revitalization. Andrew made a clumsy joke that got everyone to laugh. Jonah felt like an actor on a stage he had not expected to join, a man attempting to hold the roles of father, artisan, and soon a small business owner. He taped his daughter's drawings to the window to welcome people in. The store's sign, wood-carved and simple, read Romer's Grace in a hand-lettered script. Under the sign, a smaller plaque announced Hands of Grace, the cooperative's name. The air smelled of coffee, wood shavings, and generous conversation. At the ribbon cutting, Margaret sat in the front row with a shawl over her knees and a small smile that seemed to radiate a private peace. Evan held Jonah's hand. Jessa and Kylie served customers cookies they had helped bake. People came with curious curiosity, some looking for unique gifts, some wanting to be part of the small town's renewed impulse toward kindness. At one point, a woman bought a carved horse and told Jonah she would gift it to her grandfather who loved horses. Jonah felt shame and gratitude swell in the same chest. He had sold pieces before, but this felt like a sale that carried a passport to dignity. As months unfolded, Romer's Grace became more than a shop. It was a doorway where people exchanged skills and where the cooperative's members taught each other the language of making a life. Andrew held regular meetings to work through logistics and to keep the cooperative registered and transparent. He had the awkward humility of a man learning to apologize to the people he'd let fall by his previous busyness.
At times, he would sit across from Jonah, both men with hands marked by work, and they would plan how to reach a market 3 towns over. They drafted a simple website, sorted local wholesale accounts, and taught basic bookkeeping to cooperative members. They resisted scaling for scaling's sake. They wanted to keep what was identifiable and true, the hand in the work. Margaret, in the hum of the shop, sometimes had runs of days where the fog lifted, and she would perform tasks with a clarity that seemed to surprise even herself. On one such morning, she climbed a small ladder and arranged a string of carved birds along a shelf, humming a tune from a house long before Jonah's tenure. Customers paused, moved by her voice. A grandmother in the front corner asked Margaret the tune's name, and the two of them sang along, slow and careful, like two people repairing a bridge. Other days, Margaret required more watching. Andrew arranged for a caregiver to come twice a week, paid partly from his own pocket and supplemented by cooperative funds. They found the balance between respecting her autonomy and making sure she had the support she needed. Jonah learned to sit with the hard contradictions of this kind of life, the joy of small progress, and the humility of living with loss. Hands of Grace grew slowly. They offered classes in basic woodworking, sewing, card making, and small business skills. Jonah taught basic carving from knot to form. He was patient in a way that surprised his students, firm about hand safety, generous about letting mistakes stay as part of the creative process. One of his students was a woman named Teresa, a single mother who had been cleaning hospital rooms until her child's daycare hours changed. She joined the cooperative, learning to make wooden spoons and small toys, and within months she had a stable part-time schedule that allowed her to pick up her son daily. Another member, Earl, a retired mechanic, discovered he liked finishing wood and started teaching weekends when his knees allowed. There were small victories that did not make headlines. Jessa setting up the display window to look like a midwinter forest, and a woman returning every month for the same carved tree for her daughter's birthday. There were also defeats, a shipment lost in transit, an order rejected by a boutique because the finish varied too much. Each event pulled the cooperative to its knees or lifted it up a rung. They learned to file claims and make cookies to soften the sting of disappointment. They learned to count the small gains as seriously as the large ones. Andrew found ways to make a difference that were concrete and not theatrical. He negotiated a favorable account with a regional toy distributor who agreed to stock a limited run of the cooperative's animals, on the condition that the profits would be reinvested into skills training.
He matched crowdfunding donations with a personal pledge to a small microloan fund for cooperative members to buy tools. His company provided an intern from its communications department to help manage Romer's social media, an awkward but useful partnership. One afternoon, as the first summer rolled toward heat, Jonah sat on a crate behind the store sipping a paper cup of coffee. He watched a small line form for a local craft class he was teaching, Teresa setting up her tools, Earl showing a student how to sharpen a blade. Evan chased a pigeon with Kylie, while Jessa arranged nature-themed gift tags. A customer from the city, someone who had come specifically after reading Marisol's article, bought a set of small carved animals and asked Jonah what the initials on the underside meant. Jonah explained the small carved R and told the woman about the cooperative. The woman listened and then pressed a $20 bill into Jonah's hand with the kind of reverence people sometimes imagine for saints. "This will help," she said simply. Jonah felt his throat tighten. He thought of the kettle and the nights he had kept vigil with Margaret and the cracked phone on his kitchen counter. He thought of the reindeer that had started it all. He swallowed and smiled. "You know," the woman said, "it's more than the products, it's the hands." She gestured at the little scene of life around them, kids laughing, mothers greeting each other, the hum of a community that had decided to be tender. The hands tell a story. Jonah felt the truth of that statement, like the slow settling of a piece of furniture being placed in the exact right spot. His hands had always signaled something about him. Sud-stained sleeves from a night shift, calluses from both janitorial duty and quiet carving. He had worried that one identity might swallow the other. The cooperative had given him a way to hold both. Not everything healed. Margaret's memory still faltered. There were afternoons when she forgot a face or asked for things that could not be returned. Andrew continued to wrestle with the small shame of having been absent. He met Jonah sometimes late nights to strategize, and sometimes simply to confess. Jonah in turn offered a kind of brotherly steadiness that was not romantically forgiving, but real. He sat with Andrew in the quiet of the shop and listened to his apologies and to his plans. They both learned humility. Months later, Romer's Grace would host a small community fair. They invited local musicians and food vendors, and a small banner hung between two trees that read Community Day. The event drew more people than any of them expected. Volunteers from the cooperative ran a children's booth where little hands learned to will under watchful eyes, and where parents could watch their kids create something real. Margaret sat near the craft table and told stories, and her voice found strange patches of clarity.
Children, a comet of curiosity, sat around her and stared at a faded photograph she had pulled from her coat pocket. A young Andrew with a crooked smile. He was a boy who had once been mischievous and unstoppable. His mother told the story of the time he painted his face with jam. The kids laughed. So did the adults. The local paper ran a photo spread. The mayor, on his small podium, spoke about the importance of neighborhood initiatives and the dignity of work. The mayor's words were warmed by sincerity. Andrew stood on the sidelines, his hands in his pockets, proud without being boastful. Jonah watched his daughters in a scene he never would have scripted, but now had the right to direct. Jessa helping a small boy carve a heart, Kylie showing someone where the gift tags were. Jonah's chest tightened, the same way it had on the morning he first opened the door. Only now the pressure was steadier, not the sharpness of fear, but the fullness of a life being reshaped. At closing that day, as the sun poured like syrup over the shop's wooden sign, a woman came forward with a small paper-wrapped bundle. She had tears in her eyes, and she told Jonah about her mother, an old woman who had loved carved animals, and who had found at the end of life particular beauty in these simple gifts. She had come to buy one for the memories, she said, and to thank Jonah for keeping alive what had once been common, neighbors watching out for each other. Jonah accepted the thanks, awkwardly and with grace. In the quieter months that followed, Jonah's nights still included janitorial shifts. He held to that work not only for the money, but because it kept him honest in the way of someone who sweeps away what others discard. He taught himself to move between jobs, between making a mop line in the pale gray light of municipal stairs, and finishing the smoothness of a wooden horse, without feeling that one life diminished the other. His girls grew into their roles in the shop, and in the rhythm of a family that had learned how to barter time and tenderness. Evan, who had once clung to a soggy rabbit on a stranger's couch, became a regular helper. He learned to name the grain stretches on wood as if they were weather maps. He drew pictures to be included in packages for customers, and on cold mornings he and Jonah would sit in the van and carve the same simple pattern, two small birds facing each other, until their hands worked like a duet. Margaret's health remained a quiet, complicated presence. There were honest conversations about care and about dignity. Andrew, having rebalanced his life in some ways, put more time into ensuring his mother's stability. He also, in a gesture that felt like atonement and not performance, set up a small fund within Hands of Grace to subsidize caregiver respite for community elders. It was an imperfect gesture, but it was concrete.
The cooperative organized a small set of protocols for members who needed support, a phone tree for emergencies, a driver roster to bring elders to the clinic, a training program to help those with literacy limited manage product tags and basic inventory. Jonah helped design a grace workshop where members could learn to balance budgets and to talk simply about their rights as artisans. Andrew brought in people from his company to do pro bono training in entrepreneurship and shipping. It felt practical and human, an economy of care that had to be stewarded with humility. There were small human stories that lived inside the larger narrative. Teresa's son eventually came to the shop to help set up chairs for a pop-up concert, and the two of them learned to make payment schedules that fit daycare. Earl took on an apprentice who would eventually start his own small line of wooden bowls. A retired teacher named Miss Delgado volunteered to teach Saturday literacy classes in the back room. She told the students that letters were tools for telling doors to open. A year after the night the rain had knocked on Jonah's door, the neighborhood had changed by degrees that mattered. Sidewalks were swept a little more carefully, neighbors shared lists of who needed snow cleared, and the local grocery donated a monthly basket of produce to the cooperative's pantry to be distributed among families in need. The shop's windows looked out on a quieter street that felt more like a patchwork of people who had agreed in small ways to be gentle to one another. On a late autumn evening, when the air had a bracing, clean bite, Jonah sat behind the counter and listened to the small thrum of the shop, the chime of the door, the crackle of a wood stove, the murmur of conversations. He looked at Andrew, who was on his tablet trying to align a shipment, and at his daughters, who were sweeping under a display table as though it were their natural work. Evan, now less frightened and more curious, was counting out little tags for a wholesale order. Maggie, Margaret, sat nearby, knitting the end of an obliging scarf with a clarity that came like a generous sun. Jonah's phone, still cracked at the corner from a memory of cheaper days, buzzed a message about a school conference. He thought briefly of the nights he had worried that compassion might bankrupt him, and smiled at how the math of his life had changed. Not by magic, not by a single guaranteed miracle, but by a slow accumulation of small human acts and ownings of responsibility. He had been asked by those who came from different distances to make room in his life, and they had asked him not for surrender but for partnership. People who stopped in the shop often wanted to know how it had started, which part of the story was the miracle.
Jonah would tell them, candid and less dramatic than they expected, how one drenched boy and a confused grandmother knocked on his door, and how, in the sleeping hours, he chose to keep them warm. He would say he answered because he could not imagine teaching his daughters that the world's rules were always polite,
and that kindness was only for those with credit scores. Most listeners would not, the story settling into them like a small seed. At the center of the shop, a wooden plaque hung on the wall, carved by Jonah and painted with the cooperative's name. Under it, smaller plaques held the names of contributors and members, simple, unadorned recognition. On a Thursday in late December, Margaret walked up the few steps to the little stage they'd set up for storytelling and read a passage from a children's book. For a few minutes, she moved with the sharper, steady rhythm of someone whose mind had found a path. The room leaned in to listen. After she finished, Andrew crossed the floor and took her hand, an easy, quiet thing now, and for a moment the room was a frame for the proof that time and attention could rearrange even the hard lines of a life. No one claimed a cure. No one promised the impossible. Instead, they claimed presence, and honesty that was steady, and the kind of care that did not pretend to rewrite memory, but did insist on easing the burden of living. Jonah looked at the plaque over the counter, and at the steady hands that had built this place. He thought about the small carved deer on his kitchen shelf, and how that animal had been a seed for everything that followed. He thought about the nights of soup, and the smell of wet coats. He thought about the promise he had made, to his daughters and to himself, to be the man who taught openness rather than fear. So when people asked him, in the shop's soft hours, what the point of it all was, Jonah would sometimes say, with a little grin and a shrug, "We opened a door." He meant it literally and figuratively. He meant the simple fact. Somebody knocked in a storm, and he had opened the latch. The ripple that began with that small act had arrived here, into a storefront, into pockets of employment, into afternoons where children learned to whittle, and elders found a way to be useful and seen. The story did not become a tidy fable. Some days were still hard. Bills accumulated their patient demands. Margaret faded in parts and returned in others. The cooperative faced decisions it did not always know how to handle. But the cadence of life had shifted enough that the weight was shared. On the shop's second anniversary, they held a small gathering. Friends and neighbors and a few of the buyers who stocked their items came by. Andrew gave a short, honest speech about being a son who had to learn how to show up, and he thanked Jonah for opening the door. Jonah stood beside him and watched his daughters hand out carved tokens to visitors, little deer with smoothed edges and stamped initials.
He felt a soft, steady pride that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with being a man who had kept a promise to his children. That night, after the last customer had left and the lights were dimmed, Jonah carried a small carved deer up the street to the house where he kept his janitor cart. He placed it on his kitchen windowsill, as he had done 2 years earlier, the wood catching the porch light. He could still see the black SUV's shape in his memory and hear its engine like a heart that had come to rest. He thought of Andrew and of Margaret and of a dozen small hands that had turned a precarious ledge into steady ground. Jonah sat at his kitchen table and looked at his daughters, who were asleep with a stuffed rabbit between them, and felt the slow, honest joy of a life tended by small acts that one by one became a new math. He thought of the neighbors who had traded time and tools and kindness. He thought of the cooperative's ledger and the small, righteous habit of balancing needs with dignity. He felt humbled by the truth that no single act had saved them all, but that a single door had allowed room for a village to gather and to practice care. Before he turned off the light, Jonah picked up his carved reindeer, the one that had been the first little thing he'd given away, and smoothed its flank with his thumb. He whispered a quiet, human word into the stillness, half prayer, half promise, "Keep us humble." Then he set the deer back on the sill and went to bed, his hands smelling of wood and warm dishwater and something like hope. If this story has moved you, if you believe in opening doors for others, like and subscribe to follow more stories of hope.